Picture this nightmare. The date is November 10th, 1444. You're 20 years old. You're a king, and you have just made a fatal mistake. Ignoring the screams of your generals, you dig your spurs into the flanks of your white horse and lead 500 heavy knights in a mad, glorious dash across the marshland. Your target is the Sultan himself. You can see him in the distance, guarded by a wall of soldiers. You believe that if you cut off the head of the snake, the body will die. But as you smash into the enemy lines, the trap snaps shut. You aren't fighting panic-stricken conscripts. You've just slammed into the Janissaries, the elite, immovable wall of the Ottoman Empire. In seconds, the deafening roar of early firearms drowns out your prayers. Your horse is hamstrung and collapses beneath you. You're dragged from the saddle into the freezing mud, and the last thing you see isn't the glory of a crusade won. It's the flash of a Janissary scimitar coming down to claim your head. This single impulsive charge didn't just kill a monarch. It ended the Battle of Varna in 1,444 inches, a catastrophic defeat that left Europe wide open for invasion. But how did a massive Christian army, blessed by the Pope and led by tactical geniuses, end up being butchered in a Bulgarian swamp? Before we dive into the greatest betrayal in crusading history, make sure you're subscribed to Maproom Battles. What you're about to discover is how a broken oath, a young king's vanity, and Italian greed combined to destroy the last chance to stop Ottoman expansion and paved the way for the fall of Constantinople. To understand the blood on the battlefield, we must first understand the ink on the parchment. We have to rewind the clock just a few months to a moment when the world looked very different. The year 1444 began not with a war cry, but with a sigh of relief. Europe was exhausted. For decades, the kingdoms of Christendom had been locked in a losing struggle against the rapid rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were not just another enemy, they were a force of nature, a highly organized, gunpowder-fueled machine that had been swallowing the Balkans piece by piece. The Kingdom of Hungary stood as the last real shield protecting Central Europe, but that shield was cracking under the pressure. However, in the summer of that year, a miracle happened. After a series of brutal but successful campaigns led by the brilliant Hungarian warlord János Hunyadi, the Ottoman Sultan Murad II agreed to negotiate. This was unprecedented. Sultans did not usually beg for peace, but Murad was a complicated man. He was a warrior who hated war. He was tired of the constant campaigning, tired of the court intrigue, and grieving the death of his favorite son. He wanted something that most powerful men in history never want. He wanted to retire. Who negotiated this peace? So in the city of Szeged, a monumental treaty was drafted. The terms were incredibly favorable to the Christians. The Ottomans agreed to stop their expansion, to return lost territory, and to maintain a truce for 10 years. It was the victory Europe had been praying for. To seal this deal, a solemn ceremony took place. King Ladislaus III of Poland and Hungary placed his hand on the Bible and swore an oath to God that he would keep the peace. On the other side, the Ottoman envoys swore on the Quran. It was done. The border was secure. The wars were over. Sultan Murad II was so relieved that he actually followed through on his desire to quit. He abdicated the throne, handing the empire over to his 12-year-old son, Mehmed II, the boy who would later become the conqueror, but was then just an inexperienced child. Murad packed his bags and went to Manisa in Anatolia to drink wine, read philosophy, and enjoy a garden free of bloodshed. He believed the word of a Christian king. He believed the oath was sacred and binding. But he forgot to account for one man. Enter Julian Cesarini. Cardinal Cesarini was the papal legate, the Pope's personal representative in the region. He was a man of intense intellect, burning charisma, and absolute, terrifying conviction. When he looked at the peace of Szeged, he didn't see a victory. He saw a wasted opportunity. To Cesarini, making peace with the infidel, when they were weak, was not an act of mercy. It was a sin against God. He saw the Ottoman Empire distracted by a child sultan. He saw their armies resting. He saw a chance to wipe them off the map forever and reclaim Jerusalem. Cesarini went to work on the young king Ladislaus. Ladislaus was impressionable. He was 20 years old, full of testosterone and religious fervor, desperate to live up to the legacy of his ancestors. He looked at the peace treaty, and then he looked at the cardinal. Cesarini whispered a concept into the king's ear that remains one of the most controversial theological arguments in military history. He told the king that an oath sworn to a non-Christian was null and void in the eyes of heaven. He argued that God did not want peace. God wanted a crusade. This was the essence of the papal betrayal, a spiritual loophole designed to justify political ambition. Imagine the pressure on this young man. You are 20 years old. The voice of the Pope tells you that your honor requires you to break your word. Your generals, like the fierce Janos Hunyadi, are split. Hunyadi knows the Turks better than anyone. He respects their power, but even he is tempted by the strategic vacuum left by Murad's retirement. The logic seemed sound. The old wolf is gone. A puppy is on the throne, and we have the element of surprise. So just days after swearing on the Holy Gospel to keep the peace, King Ladislaus tore up the treaty. He declared the truce invalid. The messengers were sent out. The banners were raised. The orders were given to march. What was happening in Manisa? It was a decision made in a stone room, far from the mud and blood of reality. They thought they were marching towards an easy victory against a leaderless empire. They thought they were God's chosen warriors. They had no idea that their broken oath would trigger a chain reaction that would bring the old wolf roaring back from retirement. They didn't know that by marching south, they were not walking into a triumph, but into a trap that would squeeze them against the Black Sea. The crusade had begun, but it was built on a foundation of lies. And as they crossed the Danube River, leaving safety behind, the clock started ticking down to Varna. The die was cast, but the players hadn't yet realized that the game was rigged. While the kings and cardinals of Europe were patting themselves on the back for their clever deception, a very different scene was unfolding 300 miles away in the gardens of Manisa. Here we find the man they were so eager to destroy, Sultan Murad II. But this was not the terrifying warlord depicted in European propaganda posters. This was a man who had traded his armor for a silk robe. He was spending his days discussing poetry, watching the flowers bloom, and trying to forget the heavy burden of the crown he had just given away. For Murad, the peace of Szeged wasn't a tactical pause. It was the end of his career. He had looked at his empire, looked at his enemies, and decided he'd done enough. He handed the keys to supreme power of the Ottoman state to his son Mehmed II. Now, let's pause and talk about Mehmed. We know him today as Mehmed the Conqueror, the genius who would eventually topple Constantinople in 1453. But in 1444, he was not a conqueror. He was 12 years old. Imagine a 12-year-old boy, brilliant but arrogant, suddenly given absolute control over a military superpower, surrounded by wolves in the court. It was a disaster waiting to happen. When news of the broken treaty reached the Ottoman capital of Edirne, panic didn't just spread, it exploded. The Christian army was burning its way through Bulgaria, unchecked. The Ottoman viziers, the high-ranking ministers, were terrified. They looked at the 12-year-old boy on the throne and knew with absolute certainty that if Mehmed led the army, the empire would fall. The Grand Vizier Halil Pasha immediately sent riders galloping to Manisa with a desperate message: "Come back. We need you." But here's the twist. Murad refused. He said no. He replied that he was retired, that he had sworn an oath to leave the throne, and that the defense of the realm was now his son's problem. It was an incredible moment of stubbornness. The empire was burning, and the only man who could save it was busy refusing to work. Back in the capital, the 12-year-old Sultan Mehmed II realized he was in over his head. The enemy was closing in. His own generals were doubting him. So the boy did something that proved he had the spark of greatness in him. He dictated a letter to his father. What did the letter say? It is one of the most famous passive-aggressive notes in history. He wrote, "Father, if you are the Sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the Sultan, I hereby order you to come and lead my armies." It was checkmate. Murad II had no choice. He could not disobey a direct order from his sultan, even if that sultan was his son. With a heavy heart and a burning rage, Murad put down his wine cup and picked up his sword. But his anger wasn't just about being dragged back to work. It was about the betrayal. He was furious that the Hungarian king had sworn on the Bible and then spat on it. As Murad gathered his forces in Anatolia, he did something unprecedented. He didn't just rally the troops with promises of plunder. He rallied them with evidence of Christian treachery. He took the actual broken treaty, the piece of paper with King Ladislaus' signature, and he reportedly pinned it to a standard or carried it with him, intending to hold it up to the heavens on the battlefield. He wanted God, Jesus, Allah, and anyone else watching to see exactly who the liars were. But there was still a massive problem. To get to the Christians, Murad had to cross the Bosphorus Strait from Asia to Europe, and the Christians knew this. That was the whole point of their plan. The Papal fleet and the Venetian navy were patrolling the waters, forming an impenetrable blockade. Murad had an army of 60,000 men, but they were stuck on the wrong continent. The crusade seemed safe. The trap was supposed to be perfect. However, the Crusaders had made a classic mistake. They assumed everyone else was as pious as they were. They forgot that in the 15th century, money was a religion of its own, and waiting in the shadows were the Genoese merchants, rivals of Venice, opportunistic and very, very greedy. So we have a retired sultan furious at being dragged back to work, and an army of 60,000 Ottoman soldiers stuck on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. Standing between them and the European Crusaders is a stretch of water controlled by the Papal and Venetian fleets. On paper, the Crusaders are safe. In the minds of King Ladislaus and his supreme commander Janos Hunyadi, the war is already half won because the enemy physically cannot reach them. They believed the Venetian wall on the water was impenetrable, but history has a funny way of punishing those who rely too much on walls. While the Venetian admirals were busy counting their pay and arguing about patrol routes, a different group of Italians saw a business opportunity. The Genoese, eternal rivals of Venice, approached the desperate Sultan Murad. They didn't care about the crusade. They didn't care about the Pope. They cared about gold. A deal was struck that makes modern arms dealers look like saints. For the price of 1 gold ducat per soldier, the Genoese agreed to ferry the entire Ottoman army across the strait. What happened next was shocking. It is a scene of grotesque irony. Imagine Crusader spies watching from the cliffs, expecting to see their allies sinking Ottoman transports. Instead, they watch Genoese ships flying the flag of Christ, working day and night to shuttle 60,000 Muslim soldiers onto European soil. It is estimated that the Sultan paid over 40,000 gold ducats for this service. The irony is suffocating. The last crusade was doomed, not by enemy tactics, but by Christian capitalism. The papal betrayal wasn't just political, it was financial. Once across, Murad didn't waste a second. He force-marched his army at breakneck speed toward Varna. Meanwhile, the Crusaders were completely oblivious. They were moving leisurely through Bulgaria, besieging small forts and accepting the surrender of local garrisons. They were behaving like a victory parade, not an invasion force. Leading this parade was Janos Hunyadi, We need to respect this man. He wasn't a fool. He was a legitimate military genius. Known as the White Knight, Hunyadi had spent his life fighting the Ottomans. He invented tactics specifically designed to counter them. He knew how to use heavy wagons to break cavalry charges. He knew how to bait their light infantry. He was the one man the Ottomans truly feared. But even a genius is useless if he's blind. Hunyadi's scouts failed him. Or perhaps he was just too confident in the naval blockade. It wasn't until the Crusaders reached the city of Varna, with the Black Sea crashing against the shore, that the reality hit them. Imagine the moment the realization set in. The Crusaders had set up camp, perhaps thinking about their next easy conquest. Then scouts came galloping in, horses frothing at the mouth, with news that seemed impossible. The Sultan is here, not in Asia, not stuck at the Bosphorus. He was here, a few miles away, blocking the only road back home. And he didn't bring a small suppression force. He brought the entire imperial army. The trap had closed. The Crusaders were now pinned. To their east was the Black Sea. To the west was Lake Varna and difficult marshland. And to the north, sitting on the plateau like a thundercloud, were 60,000 Ottomans, led by a sultan who was holding a broken treaty in one hand and a sword in the other. Panic began to ripple through the camp. The numbers were terrifying. The Crusaders had maybe 20,000 to 30,000 men, a mix of heavy Polish cavalry, Hungarian nobility, and various mercenaries. The Ottomans outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1. The tactical advantages of Hunyadi's methods, mobility and wagon forts, were severely limited by the terrain. King Ladislaus, the young boy who wanted glory, suddenly looked very small. The older commanders advised a defensive stance. Let's use the wagons. Let's hold the line and wait for them to starve. But the atmosphere in the tent was electric with tension. They were cornered rats. And cornered rats usually have two choices: curl up and die, or bite back with everything they have. What would they choose? As the sun rose on November 10th, 1444, the two armies deployed for battle. The wind was blowing in from the sea, cold and biting. The Ottomans arranged themselves in their traditional crescent formation, designed to envelop the enemy. In the center stood the Janissaries, and behind them, atop a large burial mound, stood Sultan Murad II. He planted the broken treaty into the ground like a flag. The stage was set. The talking was over. The dying was about to begin. The Battle of Varna didn't begin with a single charge. It began with a storm of arrows. The Ottoman strategy was classic, effective, and deadly. Use their massive numerical advantage to envelop the smaller Christian army like a pair of giant arms. On the wings were the Sipahis, the elite Ottoman cavalry from Anatolia and Rumelia. These weren't the heavy, tank-like knights of Europe. They were fast, lightly armored, and masters of hit-and-run warfare. Against them stood the medieval cavalry charge of the Polish and Hungarian nobility, men encased in plate armor, riding massive war horses, looking like statues of steel brought to life. But statues are slow, and the mud of Varna was deep. As the Ottoman wings crashed into the Christian flanks, chaos erupted. On the Christian right, the Bishop of Varad, a religious man who probably should have stayed in church rather than commanding an army, made a critical error. Seeing the Ottoman left wing retreat, he broke formation. He ordered his men to chase them. It was exactly what the Turks wanted. The retreat stopped, the trap snapped, and the bishop's forces were suddenly surrounded and butchered. This should have been the end. The right flank was collapsing. Panic was spreading. But the Crusaders had an ace up their sleeve, Janos Hunyadi. Hunyadi was everywhere at once. This is where we see the brilliance of his tactics. He realized the king was inexperienced, so he basically told Ladislaus, "Stay here. Do not move until I say so. I will manage the battle." Leaving the king and his 500 elite bodyguards in the center as a reserve, Hunyadi galloped to the collapsing right flank. What followed was a masterclass in heavy cavalry warfare. Hunyadi slammed into the Ottoman flank with such ferocity that he didn't just stop them, he shattered them. He rescued the survivors of the bishop's blunder and drove the Ottoman Rumelian cavalry back into the hills. Then, without catching his breath, he realized the left flank was also in trouble. He wheeled his exhausted men around, galloped across the entire length of the battlefield, and smashed into the Ottoman Anatolian cavalry on the other side. It was superhuman. In the span of a few hours, Hunyadi had personally fought on both sides of the field, routed both wings of the Ottoman army, and saved the crusade from total encirclement. The 60,000-strong Ottoman force was reeling. Their cavalry was fleeing in disorder. Their morale was broken. From the vantage point of King Ladislaus, watching from the center, it looked like a miracle. The sea of turbans was parting. The enemy was running. The road to the Sultan, standing alone on his burial mound with his janissaries, seemed wide open. What was the Sultan thinking? Sultan Murad II saw this too. Ottoman chroniclers tell us that in this moment, the Sultan was terrified. He actually turned his horse to flee. He thought the battle was lost. But a veteran janissary grabbed the reins of the Sultan's horse and forced him to stay. "You cannot leave us," he reportedly shouted. The Sultan stayed, frozen in place, guarded by the Janissary Corps, the last line of defense between the crusade and victory. Hunyadi returned to the king, covered in blood and sweat, but triumphant. His orders were simple and wise. "We have won the flanks. Now we wait." The Sultan is protected by the janissaries in a field of stakes. We do not charge them. We let them break against our shield wall. It was the perfect plan. It was the winning strategy. But Hunyadi made one mistake. He underestimated the ego of a 20-year-old king who had just watched his general get all the glory. History is full of moments where victory is snatched away by bad luck. But at Varna, it was thrown away by bad advice. While Janos Hunyadi was busy securing the flanks, a toxic conversation was happening around the king. Ladislaus III was surrounded by his personal guard, young, hot-blooded Polish nobles who had spent the entire battle watching Hunyadi do all the work. They were jealous. They whispered poison into the king's ear. "Look at Hunyadi," they said. "He's winning the battle for you. When the bards sing songs of this day, they will sing of the White Knight, not the king," one advisor reportedly told him. "If you do not attack now, the glory will belong to a mere subject. Charge now, destroy the Sultan yourself, and become a legend like Alexander the Great." It was the oldest trap in the book, vanity. Ladislaus looked across the field. He saw the Sultan standing exposed on the burial mound. He saw the Ottoman wings broken. He did not see a trap. He saw a trophy. Ignoring Hunyadi's explicit orders to hold the line, the king drew his sword. He didn't signal the whole army. He didn't wait for infantry support. He simply took his 500 personal heavy knights and charged straight down the center of the battlefield. It must have looked magnificent. 500 armored knights thundering across the plain, banners snapping in the wind, aiming like a spear tip at the heart of the Ottoman Empire. But as they got closer, they realized why the Sultan hadn't run away. He wasn't unprotected. He was standing behind the Janissary Corps. This was not a normal infantry unit. The Janissaries were slave soldiers, raised from childhood to do exactly one thing: kill without fear. They wore distinctive white caps and long robes. As the Polish knights charged, the Janissaries didn't panic. They didn't break. They stood in absolute silence, a wall of white against the dark mud. When the knights came within range, the silence was shattered. The Janissaries were not just armed with spears. They were early adopters of massed firepower. Volleys of arrows and early arquebuses tore into the horses. What happened to the charge? The knights crashed into the defensive ditch the Janissaries had dug, a detail the king couldn't see from a distance. The charge lost all momentum. It turned into a slaughter. The knights were pulled from their horses and hacked to pieces with halberds and scimitars. But Ladislaus, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, actually managed to break through the first line. For a split second, he was close enough to see the Sultan's face. He was that close to changing history. But then, his horse was struck. The king of Poland and Hungary fell into the mud. Before he could rise, a veteran janissary named Koja Husayn rushed forward. There was no duel. There was no chivalrous exchange of words. Husayn simply swung his scimitar and cut off the king's head. The effect was instantaneous. Husayn hoisted the king's head onto the tip of a silver lance and lifted it high into the air. He shouted to the wavering Ottoman troops, "Behold the head of your enemy!" In 1 second, the battle flipped. The sight of their king's head on a spike shattered the Crusader army's spirit instantly. The Polish knights screamed in horror and fled. The Hungarian lines wavered. János Hunyadi, returning from the flank to see what had happened, reportedly stared in disbelief. He shouted one final tragic order to his men. "The king is dead. We fight now for our lives. Save yourselves." The Battle of Varna was effectively over. It had gone from a tactical masterpiece to a total catastrophe in less than 20 minutes. The sun was setting, and the massacre was just beginning. When an army breaks, it doesn't just stop fighting. It ceases to be an army. It becomes a stampede of terrified animals. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that bloody November day, the chaotic retreat of the Crusaders began. But remember the geography we talked about? The Black Sea to the east, the marshland to the south, and the enemy to the north. There was nowhere to run. The Battle of Varna didn't end with a whistle. It ended with a hunt. As the panic spread, thousands of Christian soldiers, men who had marched hundreds of miles with dreams of liberating Jerusalem, found themselves bogged down in the freezing mud of the Bulgarian wetlands. The heavy armor that had made them invincible tanks during the charge now became their metal coffins. Knights slipped from their saddles and drowned in inches of water, too heavy to stand back up. The Ottoman light cavalry, the Sipahis who had been battered earlier in the day, now returned with a vengeance. They didn't need to fight formation battles anymore. They simply rode down the stragglers. The night air was filled with the screams of men being cut down and the desperate prayers of those trying to hide in the reeds. In the center of this apocalypse was János Hunyadi. The White Knight was no longer thinking about victory. He was thinking about survival. He knew that if he died here, Hungary would be defenseless. Gathering a small knot of survivors, he fought his way out of the encirclement. It was a harrowing escape. What happened to those left behind? Legends say he had to cut his way through lines of looters and furious janissaries. He barely made it to the Danube, leaving behind the destruction of his life's work. Back on the battlefield, the Crusaders' camp, the Wagenburg or Wagon Fort, was the last pocket of resistance. The infantry who hadn't run away huddled behind their wagons, hoping for mercy. There was none. The Ottomans stormed the camp the next morning. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. When the sun rose on November 11th, the scale of the disaster was visible. The field was carpeted with bodies. It is estimated that 15,000 to 20,000 men lay dead or dying. But it wasn't a one-sided massacre. The Ottomans had suffered terribly too. Their own casualties were so heavy that for 3 days, Sultan Murad II didn't even know if he had truly won. There is a haunting story recorded by Ottoman chroniclers about this morning. Sultan Murad II walked across the battlefield, stepping over the tangled bodies of friend and foe. He eventually came to the spot where King Ladislaus had fallen. The king's head was gone, already on its way to be preserved in honey as a grisly trophy to be displayed in the Ottoman capital. But his body remained, stripped of its royal armor, looking like any other dead boy in the mud. An advisor congratulated the Sultan on his glorious victory. Murad reportedly looked at the carnage, shook his head, and said, "May Allah never grant such a victory to my enemies." He wasn't boasting. He was traumatized. He had lost thousands of his best men. He'd seen the flower of his army withered. The victory was decisive, yes, but the cost was astronomical. However, the political result was absolute. The head of Ladislaus III was taken on a tour. It was paraded through the cities of the Ottoman Empire and eventually taken to the old capital Bursa. The message was clear. The crusade is dead. The kings of Europe are mortal, and the House of Osman is here to stay. For the survivors like Hunyadi, the nightmare wasn't over. As he fled through Wallachia to get home, he was actually captured and imprisoned, not by the Turks, but by Vlad Dracul, Dracula's father, the very man who had warned them not to go. Vlad held him for ransom, essentially saying, "I told you so." It was a humiliating end to a humiliating campaign. But while the Europeans were busy blaming each other, the real winner of Varna was quietly watching from the sidelines. The young Mehmed II, the 12-year-old boy who had been pushed aside, watched his father crush the Christians. He learned a valuable lesson that day. The West is not invincible. They're divided, they're arrogant, and they can be beaten. 9 years later, that boy would use the lessons of Varna to march on the ultimate prize, Constantinople. In the days following the slaughter, a strange and haunting silence fell over the courts of Europe. The messengers who brought the news of Varna didn't just bring reports of a defeat, they brought a crisis of faith. What was the theological crisis? How could God allow a crusade blessed by the Pope and led by a pious king to be annihilated by the infidel? The theological loophole that Cardinal Cesarini had used, that oaths to non-Christians didn't matter, had backfired spectacularly. It seemed God did care about oaths, and he had delivered a terrible verdict. But amidst the grief, a bizarre rumor began to spread. Survivors trickling back to Hungary and Poland reported something confusing. Nobody could find the king's body. Yes, the Ottomans had a head in a jar of honey that they claimed was Ladislaus's. But was it really him? The head was reportedly blonde. The king was known to have darker hair. The armor was stripped. There were no witnesses who survived the final circle of death to confirm it 100%. This uncertainty gave birth to one of the most fascinating conspiracy theories of the Middle Ages. People refused to believe their young hero was dead. Legends sprang up that Ladislaus had survived the charge, escaped the battlefield in the chaos, and fled into exile to do penance for his sin of breaking the oath. The most famous version of this legend claims he traveled all the way to the Portuguese island of Madeira, living out the rest of his days as a mysterious hermit known as Henrique Alemão, Henry the German. While historians are 99% sure Ladislaus died in the mud at Varna, the persistence of this legend shows us the psychological trauma of the event. Europe couldn't accept that their golden boy had been butchered so easily. They needed a ghost story to cope with the reality. But while the peasants whispered about ghost kings, the politicians faced a terrifying reality. The Battle of Varna had shattered the crusading spirit once and for all. Before Varna, there was always a hope that if things got bad enough, the Pope could snap his fingers and the kings of France, England, Germany, and Poland would unite to save the day. Varna killed that hope. When the Pope tried to call for a new crusade to avenge Varna, the response was deafening silence. France was busy fighting England. Germany was fragmented. Poland was plunged into chaos because their king was dead or missing. And Hungary, the shield of Christendom, was battered and bleeding. This paralysis was fatal for one city in particular, Constantinople. For centuries, the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople had played a dangerous game. They used the threat of a Western crusade as a bargaining chip to keep the Ottomans at bay. They would tell the sultans, "If you attack us, our brothers in the West will come and destroy you." Varna exposed this as a bluff. The West had come, and the West had been destroyed. The prequel to the fall of Constantinople was now complete. The Ottoman sultans now knew that Europe was a paper tiger. They knew that, no matter how much the Pope screamed, no army was coming to save the Byzantines. The psychological wall protecting Constantinople had collapsed 9 years before the physical walls did. Furthermore, the battle solidified the power of the Janissary Corps and the Ottoman state structure. The internal critics who said Ottoman expansion was too fast or too risky were silenced. The victory proved that the Ottoman war machine was superior to the best knights Europe could offer. It validated the aggressive expansionist policy that would terrify Europe for the next 200 years. What happened next? So as the dust settled on the 1440s, the stage was set for the final act of the Roman Empire. The old Sultan Murad II, having saved his empire, went back to his retirement briefly, leaving the throne once again to his ambitious son Mehmed. But this time, Mehmed wasn't just a scared 12-year-old boy writing letters to his dad. He was a young man who had watched the invincible Christian knights break and run. He'd smelled their fear, and he was looking at the map with hungry eyes. In 1451, 7 years after the slaughter at Varna, the old wolf Sultan Murad II finally died. Across the capitals of Europe, metaphorical champagne corks popped. Ambassadors and kings breathed a sigh of relief. They believed the danger was over. The terrifying warrior sultan was gone, replaced by that same awkward, bookish boy who had been so incompetent back in 1444 that his own father had to come out of retirement to save him. The rulers of Europe looked at the now 19-year-old Mehmed II and saw a weakling. They sent him insulting gifts. They demanded concessions. They practically bullied him, thinking he was a soft intellectual who cared more about gardening than warfare. They were making the exact same mistake Ladislaus had made at Varna. They underestimated the enemy. What they didn't realize was that the boy had grown up. The trauma of 1444, the shame of being pushed aside, the sight of his father having to clean up his mess, had forged Mehmed into something cold, hard, and incredibly dangerous. He hadn't spent those 7 years gardening. He'd spent them studying. He studied why the crusade had failed. He studied the walls of Constantinople. And most importantly, he studied the psychology of the West. Mehmed knew that Varna had broken the spine of European unity. He knew that Hungary was exhausted. He knew that János Hunyadi, though still a threat, was busy fighting internal enemies and defending his own borders. The Grand Coalition was dead. So when Mehmed marched his army to the walls of Constantinople in 1453, it was the direct sequel to Varna. The prequel was over. The main event had begun. Inside the doomed city, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, looked west. He stood on the ancient walls and scanned the horizon, praying for the dust clouds that would signal the arrival of a Hungarian army. He was waiting for a Varna too, but this time, a successful one. He hoped that János Hunyadi, the champion of Christ, would ride over the hill and smash the Ottoman siege, just like he had smashed the Ottoman flanks 9 years earlier. But the horizon remained empty. Why? Where was Hunyadi? Where was the Pope? The answer lies in the graves of Varna. The destruction of the Polish and Hungarian nobility in 1444 had been so severe that it took a generation to recover. Hunyadi was indeed still alive, and he was still fighting. In fact, he would go on to win a miraculous victory at Belgrade 3 years later in 1456. But in 1453, the political will to launch a massive offensive expedition deep into Ottoman territory simply didn't exist. Why not? The broken oath of King Ladislaus had not only killed an army, it had killed the political credibility of the Crusade movement. No one wanted to risk another king, another treasury, another generation of knights on a gamble. So Constantinople stood alone. The ghost of Varna haunted the walls, The cannons that battered the Theodosian walls were fired by an army that had been hardened and validated by their victory in 1444. The Janissaries who scaled the breaches were the same men who had stood firm against the Polish charge. When Constantinople finally fell on May 29th, 1453, it was the final domino in a chain reaction started by the papal betrayal and the Battle of Varna. The West had had their chance to stop the Ottomans. They had a treaty in 1444 that would have kept the Ottomans out of Europe. They broke it. They fought. They lost. And now they had to watch as the center of their world was erased from the map. Mehmed II was no longer the awkward boy. He rode into the Hagia Sophia as the conqueror. And as he looked at the magnificent dome, perhaps he thought back to that swampy field in Bulgaria and the severed head of the king who had tried to destroy him. While King Ladislaus found a quick, glorious death at the tip of a spear, the man who sent him there met a much darker end. Julian Cesarini, the brilliant, fanatical papal legate who had whispered the poison of breaking the oath into the king's ear, did not die fighting. As the Crusader alliance collapsed, Cesarini did what politicians often do when their policies fail. He ran. But the battlefield of Varna was not a place of mercy. Reports on his death vary, and each is more grim than the last. Some say he was cut down by pursuing Sipahis. Others say he drowned in the marsh, weighed down by the gold he carried. But the most persistent and poetic rumor is that he wasn't killed by the enemy. Legend has it that as Cesarini fled, he was cornered by a group of Hungarian survivors. These men had lost their king, their friends, and their honor because of this man's theological loophole. In a fit of rage, they reportedly stripped him naked, robbed him, and left him to bleed out in the freezing mud. Whether true or not, the message of history is clear. The man who claimed God wanted them to break their word was abandoned by both God and man in his final moments. But what of János Hunyadi? The White Knight had lost the battle, but he had not lost his soul. Hunyadi spent the next decade rebuilding. He didn't sulk. He didn't retire. He prepared for the rematch. He knew that once Constantinople fell in 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror would come for Hungary next, and come he did. In 1456, 3 years after taking Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II marched on Belgrade. He brought an army even bigger than the one at Varna. He brought the cannons that had shattered the walls of Byzantium. He expected to walk right through into Central Europe, but waiting for him on the walls was the old wolf, János Hunyadi. This wasn't Varna. Hunyadi wasn't taking orders from an arrogant boy king anymore. He was in command. What happened at Belgrade? He used his signature tactics to perfection. He broke the Ottoman naval blockade on the Danube, ironically using a river fleet, and correcting the mistake of 1,444. He led a peasant crusade, a ragtag army of farmers, armed with pitchforks and religious fury, in a surprise counterattack that stunned the professional Janissaries. In the chaos, the invincible Mehmed the Conqueror was wounded by an arrow and carried unconscious from the field. The Ottoman army was routed. It was a victory so total, so miraculous, that it stopped Ottoman expansion into Central Europe for 70 years. Hunyadi had redeemed himself. He had avenged the ghosts of Varna, but he didn't live to enjoy it. Just weeks after the victory, an epidemic, likely the plague, swept through the camp. The man who could not be killed by swords or cannons was taken by a microscopic germ, but he left behind a legacy that you, yes, you listening right now, might still hear today. When news of the siege of Belgrade reached Rome, the Pope ordered all church bells to be rung at noon to call believers to pray for the defenders. After the victory, the custom remained. So if you're ever in Europe or in a Catholic country and you hear the church bells ringing at 12 p.m., that is not just a time check. That is the noon bell. It is a 500-year-old sound echo honoring János Hunyadi, and the victory that saved Europe, proving that while Varna was a tragedy, the spirit of resistance did not die in the swamp. History is often taught as a series of inevitable events. We assume the Ottoman Empire was destined to rule. We assume Constantinople was destined to fall. But when you look closely at the Battle of Varna, you realize that destiny is fragile. It can be shattered by a single bad decision, a single moment of arrogance, or a single broken promise. If King Ladislaus had kept his word, if the papal ships had not been bypassed by Genoese greed, if the king hadn't charged into the Janissaries for a moment of glory, the world we live in today would be radically different. The Ottoman rise might have been halted right there in the Balkans. Constantinople might have survived as a bastion of Eastern Christianity, preserving libraries and art that were lost forever. The map of Europe, the Middle East, and even the discovery of the Americas, driven by the need to bypass Ottoman trade routes, could have been rewritten. Varna wasn't just a battle. It was a crossroads. One path led to the survival of the old medieval order. The other path, the one we took, led to the dominance of the gunpowder empires and the birth of the modern world through blood and fire. What lessons does Varna teach us? The tragedy of Varna teaches us brutal lessons about leadership. It shows us that courage without wisdom is just suicide. It reminds us that integrity, keeping your word, is not just a moral luxury. It is a geopolitical necessity. The Crusaders thought they could cheat and still win God's favor. They were wrong. They paid for their lie with the last great army of the Middle Ages. The contrast between Hunyadi's tactical genius and the king's fatal vanity reveals a timeless dynamic. The tension between experienced professionals and impulsive leaders. Hunyadi had spent a lifetime fighting the Ottomans. He knew exactly what would work, but his wisdom was overruled by a 20-year-old's ego and the jealous whispers of courtiers. This pattern repeats throughout history. In World War I, experienced generals were overruled by political leaders who thought frontal assaults would bring glory. In Vietnam, field commanders who understood guerrilla warfare were ignored by politicians in Washington. In corporate boardrooms, veteran managers watched their strategies destroyed by CEOs chasing quarterly glory. The lesson is clear. Listen to the people who have done the actual work. Trust expertise over enthusiasm. Value wisdom over youth. When you ignore the Janos Hunyadis of your organization and listen to the ambitious young advisors instead, you end up with your head on a pike. The role of greed in undermining the crusade is particularly instructive. The Genoese merchants who ferried the Ottoman army across the Bosphorus weren't ideological traders. They were businessmen, following profit. This reveals an uncomfortable truth. Money has no loyalty. When the Venetians were paid to blockade the strait, and the Genoese were paid more to break the blockade, capitalism worked exactly as designed. Modern parallels abound. Defense contractors selling weapons to both sides of a conflict. Tech companies providing surveillance tools to authoritarian regimes while claiming to value freedom. Investment banks financing projects they know will fail. The Genoese at Varna are the ancestors of everyone who has ever said, "It's just business." But business decisions have consequences. Those 60,000 soldiers the Genoese ferried across led directly to the fall of Constantinople and the reshaping of world history. The theological manipulation by Cardinal Cesarini introduces another layer. He used religion as a weapon of political ambition. He told a young king that God wanted him to break his oath. This is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. Claim divine authority for your earthly agenda. Every tyrant in history has done this. Kings claim divine right. Crusaders claimed God willed it. Modern politicians claim to speak for their God while pursuing very worldly goals. The lesson from Cesarini's fate, dying alone in the mud, possibly killed by his own men, is that people eventually see through the manipulation. You can use religion, patriotism, or ideology to motivate people into terrible decisions. But when those decisions lead to disaster, the manipulators rarely escape consequences. What about broken promises? The broken oath, at the heart of Varna's tragedy, speaks to the foundation of civilization itself. Treaties and promises are what allow enemies to coexist without constant warfare. When you normalize breaking your word, you don't just betray one person, you destroy the entire framework of trust that makes peace possible. The Crusaders learned this the hard way. They broke their oath, thinking it gave them strategic advantage. Instead, it gave them a reputation for treachery that haunted Europe for generations. Modern international relations operate on the same principle. When nations violate treaties, they gain short-term tactical benefits, but lose long-term strategic credibility. When America abandoned the Iran nuclear deal, it gained domestic political points but lost negotiating credibility. When Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum, it gained Crimea but lost the trust of every nation that might consider giving up weapons. The Ghost King legend reveals how societies process collective trauma. Rather than accepting that their golden boy died in the mud because of his own vanity, medieval Europe created a story where he survived to do penance. We do this constantly. Lost cause mythology in the American South. Stab-in-the-back legends in post-WWI Germany. Any narrative that preserves pride while explaining defeat. Thank you for joining me on Maproom Battles for this deep dive into the battle that ended the crusading era and opened the gates for Ottoman conquest. If you enjoyed discovering how a broken oath, youthful arrogance, and Italian greed combined to destroy Europe's last chance, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where one decision changes world history. I want to hear from you. Was Cardinal Cesarini right to argue that promises to enemies don't count? Or was the defeat at Varna divine punishment for treachery? If you were in King Ladislaus' position, would you have charged the Sultan for personal glory or trusted Hunyadi's strategy? And in your own life, have you ever seen experienced wisdom overruled by ambitious inexperience? Share your thoughts in the comments. This story teaches us that integrity matters, that expertise should be respected, that greed has no loyalty, and that vanity kills. Until next time, remember that the greatest disasters aren't caused by lack of strength. They're caused by lack of wisdom. The Crusaders had the strength to win at Varna. They just lacked the wisdom to keep their promises and trust their generals.